Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Charlie Dixon. Joining us today is Dr. Sharnell Myles. Sharnell is the Chief Clinical Officer at Embark Behavioral Health and is a licensed psychotherapist and certified clinical trauma professional with over 25 years of experience specializing in complex trauma treatment. She is the founder of Joyous Beginnings Child and Family Wellness Center and the Urban Trauma Positive Impact Center Incorporated in Atlanta. Dr. Myles is a sought after executive, keynote, and trainer in the area of behavioral health, policy, and trauma, including abuse, community based trauma, racial based trauma, and domestic minor sex trafficking. She has developed trauma informed systems of care from various organizations and authored Georgia's first domestic minor sex trafficking protocol for schools. Dr. Myles serves on numerous boards, including the DeKalb County Juvenile Court Mental Health Court and Together the Voice, Association of Children's Residential Centers, and is a sought after expert in child and adolescent trauma, offering expert testimony and training for diverse professionals. We're so excited to have Sharnell with us today to discuss working in trauma with younger populations. Welcome to the show, Sharnell.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I always am really interested in how people got to their chosen field. Like, what was that journey look like? So to get us started, can you share with our listeners what inspired you to specialize in trauma treatment?
Sure. So it has certainly been a long journey for me, over 25 years. And really, this journey for me started as a little girl. And so when I tell people that they kind of lean in and they're like, oh, I want to hear. So what happened to you? And, I have to say, well, it may not necessarily have been what happened to me. But as a young child, I just kind of watched my parents who adopted 5 children outside of their 3 biological girls. And they were foster parents to over 50 children. And so, growing up, there were a lot of personalities in our home. My foster sisters and brothers and adoptive sisters and brothers came from just a variety of backgrounds. But as I got older, I noticed that all of them had this commonality, and it really was trauma. Some may be complex trauma, some may have experienced just one form of trauma. But as a child and as a teenager, I knew that whatever they experienced impacted them in a way that back then I thought it made them different. It did make them less lovable, though, right? And so in my home, it was our sisters and our brothers. We didn't say
Mm,
our foster sisters or foster brothers. And
um,
our parents treated them just like they treated all of the other kids. There was no respite. When we traveled, they traveled. And so that was the other side of what I saw, which some may say is just unconditional love and positive regard. I just saw my parents loving on the community. But even outside of that, even though I had a loving home and siblings, when I walked out of my home, and I grew up in South Philadelphia,
okay.
I walked out of my home and I went to school, it was like I had to fight to survive. And when I say fight to survive, I mean physically fight. I was a fighter. And so just very early on, I also had some experiences that did happen to me. Like once I was in a corner store with my younger sister who is 8 years younger than me. I think I had to be about in the 10th or 11th grade. And this guy came in and he held a gun to my head, all because he wanted a gold chain that I had on. And back then, again, remember I said I was a fighter. So, the young Sharnell was like, no, I'm not giving up my chain. you know, I kind of think back on it now and be like, girl, I was like, what could have happened? And thank God nothing maybe serious did happen, but something serious did happen, if
Yeah,
that kinda makes sense,
it
because
does.
that also just kind of triggers something in me like, girl, you got to fight harder. This world is unsafe. Even in this neighborhood that you grew up in your entire life, like you still have to watch your back. And these things can happen to you. And then, I had to deal with just some of the things that came after that, like the fear, the apprehension. Of course, my dad kind of went after the guy. So then there was something else that I had to worry about that
Yeah.
impacted me. So that is kind of in short how I continue to move along this journey. I've always felt that I was a helper or a servant leader, and over the years, as I begin to grow and just really understand the things that were happening in my community, happening to my loved ones, this is where it landed me. And to be honest, I never thought that I would be sitting in this chair, but this is where I am, and there's purpose behind that.
Absolutely. And I mean, speaking of that purpose and the obvious passion that you have for this type of work, how did that lead you to Joyous Beginnings and Embark Behavioral Health? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. So again, I mentioned just early on being aware of community-based trauma,
Mhm.
and it goes a lot deeper than what I mentioned, right? And so for me, it was okay, what am I here to do? How can I serve? What is my purpose? And I've always understood what my purpose was. And so out of that came Joyous Beginnings. And so Joyous Beginnings was a community-based trauma informed agency in Atlanta, Georgia. And primarily, we served families who were really underrepresented and who experienced issues of trauma. And so that could have been sexual abuse, physical abuse. It could have just been a number of things. And so, even out of that, we had some specialized programs, primarily for young girls and women who were survivors of domestic minor sex trafficking, as well as mothers who already had confirmed diagnoses but who were also expecting children, because one of the things that we've always believed in was what we call a two-gen approach, right? We can't just take the kids in and work with them. No, we were committed to working with the child, the mom, the dad, and sometimes the grandparents in order to effectuate change within the family system. And so that is where Joyous Beginnings started over the years, because I was very early on a prominent trauma specialist in that area. I had the pleasure of teaching and mentoring and supervising younger therapists, which is also, a pleasure of mine. And so that's where Joyous Beginnings started. And
Okay.
so
Okay.
then out of that, I kind of graduated, as I say, to Embark Behavioral Health. And so with Embark Behavioral Health, I was actually hired on as a vice president. And I had the absolute pleasure of opening Embark's first community based clinic. And with the clinics, we offer services at an IOP and PHP level. And so that was in 2000. And as of today, we have 18 clinics throughout the
Wow.
US. Yes,
Wow.
yes.
Right.
So
Congratulations.
thank you. And as that was during the pandemic. And so unfortunately, while many other companies and mental health providers were going totally virtual, and unfortunately having to close their doors even through that mental health crisis time,
Mhm.
Embark was opening doors and just meeting the needs of thousands of families in their own communities. So
Nice, nice. I really appreciate the full family approach that you take because, like you said, it really isn't just the child or just the outward symptoms or effects of the trauma. It really does. It affects the whole family, and in some cases, may even be generational. So we'll talk about generational trauma, and I'm sure later. But I just wanted to mention that it really isn't just the child or working with the child, but what happens with the whole entire family. It affects everyone.
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So really, I'm trying to go back and set a foundation for today. Can you help us understand what trauma actually looks like in youth? And is there a difference from what we can see in adults? What does that really look like?
Yeah. So, one of the things for us to remember is that what may be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you or someone else, right? And so our earlier or early experiences, our belief systems, our environment really does play a role in what we deem or define as traumatic. And so trauma can include anything, sexual abuse, physical abuse. It can also include neglect. And sometimes neglect is hard to see or
Yeah.
prove, but we see the consequences of it. It can be school bullying. It can be being involved in or witnessing a car crash. It could be being involved in a war. And so there are just a number of issues or things that can be defined as traumatic. But when we look at it, it really is an event that pushes you past your normal ability to cope with something. And so, you may have immediate symptoms or signs of experiencing a trauma, such as nightmares, the inability to sleep, being nervous or fidgeting. And then you can also have some long term symptoms, such as the trauma leading to depression, suicidality, or self harming behaviors or post traumatic stress disorder.
Right. And you mentioned just a few of the signs and symptoms. I kind of have a two-pronged question here. So, as a caregiver, or how can a caregiver and an educator, how can they see these things early on? I know a lot of times children show up and they are able to mask it, especially
Yeah.
at school. But what are some things that educators can look for, or parents that say, my child is fine, they do fine things at home? What kind of things can they see? And then also, what are some more subtle signs, some more small things that may just add up to something more for a child?
Yeah. Honestly, I love that you asked that question because nowadays you may have teachers, you may have school counselors who receive some degree of training in
Yes.
trauma, right?
Mhm.
But sometimes trauma and its effects can be really tricky just in terms of understanding it and understanding that you are seeing the impact of a trauma. And so over the years, my work has allowed me to work in school districts. I have had the pleasure of supporting a school district in Minnesota after the George Floyd murder because a lot of the students and the teachers were reporting that they had been traumatized. And so a teacher may see a child who's been attending school, had been attentive, doing well in class, but now they may be attending school but falling asleep, appearing pretty nervous or fidgety, not completing homework, maybe coming to school crying. There may be some inattentiveness or where a kid may look like they're daydreaming, right? But that daydreaming can be a form of dissociation. And so there are so many things. And what I tell teachers, what I tell parents is that if you see like one sign, it may not be evidence that, a child has experienced a trauma or has a disorder. But a lot of times, what you will see is a cluster of symptoms, right? So you may see it at home, at school, in the community, several areas, and a number of symptoms. It can be a kid who withdraws or appears to be withdrawn, where initially they were a very outgoing kid. They may start hanging with a different group of kids.
Mhm.
They may eat less, but they can also eat more. They may cry less and they can cry more. And so, again, this may also look different based on where they are developmentally. And so a 4-year-old who has experienced, a significant loss of a primary relationship or abuse, they may respond one way compared to a kid who is 10 or 12 who experienced the same thing. You may see different behaviors.
Absolutely. And I'm actually glad that you mentioned how, trauma may affect differently in different developmental stages. You mentioned briefly 4 years old, maybe versus, an older child or a preteen. So are there long-term effects if it's not addressed? Is it something that we see? Maybe something happened at 4, we didn't deal with it, or we didn't even know as a parent. What does that look like later? Can we address it later? Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, it's never too late to address anything dealing with your mental health. I tell people if you're walking and you stump your toe on the side of the bed, that pain we all have probably experienced in pain. And then 2, 3 weeks later, we're still getting this aching pain in our toe. You end up going to see your primary health provider or your podiatrist. The same thing with mental health. Don't ignore it because your emotions, your feelings, your brain, your mental health is just important as what we consider our physical health because we are holistic beings. So, yes, there's a lot that you can do. Oftentimes, and you may have heard the term developmental trauma, right?
Yes.
That happens pretty early on in a kid's life, anywhere typically from 0 to 8 years. Well, those are formative years. And so, if there's some type of traumatic insult that happens, we don't want to ignore that because I'm almost going to guarantee you that you're going to see an impact later on in adolescent years or in adult years, right? And so if there's a kid who, let's say, has experienced emotional abuse, I'll use a good one, bullying, right? Which
Mhm.
can be traumatic. They experience traumatic bullying. Then, once they become an adolescent, you may see some of that begin to play out in their relationships with their peers. They may have difficulty developing relationships or maintaining relationships. There may be some self esteem issues. They may become an aggressor or the bully, and then you may also see that play out in their adult relationships because the trauma has now gone unresolved. For, some kids who have experienced developmental trauma, it's pretty hard for that on and off switch to be activated just in terms of their emotions or their ability to feel safe. And so, again, in those adolescent years and those adult years, you may see that behavior play out within their relationships. And I will say this too. When I started or founded Joyous Beginnings years ago, my quest was to help every child on this planet, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And to address the whole issue of trauma. And when people would ask me, who do I serve? I would say kids, teenagers, over the years, I think I have seen more women, more adults walk through that door. And oftentimes, the referral question or issue would be I want to come in because I'm having difficulty with my spouse or relations on my job,
Mhm.
or I've experienced the trauma, and all of these things are coming back to me. But during that therapeutic process, 99.9% of the time, there were issues that started in early childhood.
Mhm.
So, to answer your question, yes, oftentimes we will see the effects of early traumas play out in adolescence or adulthood.
Absolutely. And just like you said, it can be so tricky to even kind of pinpoint maybe even what the trauma may have been, because
Yeah.
some children can't even tell you what that may have been. And then even what those symptoms, what they look like. Because one day I might be okay as a child and the next day I may not be, or
Yeah.
even trying to juggle in myself what that feels like and what it looks like, trying to hold it together. So
Yeah.
thank you for addressing that. But speaking of how to resolve it and address it, what types of therapeutic approaches and techniques do you feel are most effective when working with traumatized youth? And so, are there specific models or frameworks that you find particularly helpful?
Mhm. Absolutely. So the first step, which we talk a lot about even through our work at Embark, is really reducing the stigma, right? And so the
Mhm.
first step is recognizing and being okay and saying, hey, something's going on with me. I experienced this event. I think I need help. And then reaching out to a provider, whether it be a licensed therapist, social worker, or a psychologist, psychiatrist. So that's the first thing, reducing the stigma and being okay to say something's going on, I need help. And so from then, I do recommend treatments that are trauma informed, particularly if someone has, experienced a trauma. I do recommend that you treat from a systems perspective because oftentimes when individuals come to therapy, they have a mom at home, a dad at home, sisters and brothers,
Yep.
somebody at home. And so, with that being said, your behavior is probably impacting the folks around you and vice
Yeah.
versa. What better way to go through, treatment and healing than with a good support system? So definitely a systems approach. And then for me, professionally, I've been trained in trauma informed CBT for years and working with the developers of trauma informed CBT, and also had the pleasure of contributing to TFCBT manuals for
Wow.
kids who have been involved in domestic minor sex trafficking, as well as LGBTQ plus youth. And so it is a gold standard treatment that we know works, but just like any other treatment, may not work for everyone. But again, it addresses trauma, safety, cognitive restructuring, just a number of things. And I've seen really help individuals, particularly kids and adolescents, get back to living a healthy life with Embark Behavioral Health or the Embark treatment approach. And it really does help to address developmental trauma from the standpoint of safety, the commitment, a number of things. And so, for us, there is a strong family component with the services that we provide and the treatment that we utilize, because again, we believe that there's healing that happens within primary relationships that also lead to becoming more healthy.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that the first thing you mentioned was stigma. So, not just the stigma of needing mental health services, period, but I think as parents, it is very, very difficult to say my child needs some extra help. That
Yeah.
is, I mean, I'm personally say I've been there, and it can be hard to say, okay, my baby needs some things that
Mhm.
I'm not able to address at home. Like, how can I get help for my child, and then also for my family as a whole? How can we heal altogether? So I really appreciate that that is one of the first things that you mentioned as a way to help. On the other side, I'm glad that you said TFCBT, because that is, while I'm not necessarily a practitioner that way, I don't necessarily do psychotherapy or
Mhm.
private practice. That is something that I think all mental health professionals should look into as a treatment modality, because it can work with all
Yeah.
different types of people from
Mhm.
all backgrounds. So I'm refreshed to hear that that is something that you use often in your practices. And it doesn't just work with children, it also, has some good work with adults as well. So how do you think then that the way children process and express their emotions, of course it differs from adults, but how do you think that that influences therapeutic intervention?
Ooh, big question. You know what? It has changed over the years, and I may
Mhm.
be dating myself a little bit, but that is okay for the people. That is okay because when I was a young therapist, look, when I was a young therapist, gosh, our teenagers and our children have been
Different.
faced with so much
Mhm.
just over the past 5 years, the
Mhm.
past 10 years, that I think their worldview has significantly changed. And with that, their ability to communicate or not and how they cope has significantly changed.
Agreed.
And so, you know, we as practitioners have to be mindful and skilled to assess what we see and what we hear and what we don't see and what we
Mhm.
don't hear, right?
Yep.
And for a lot of our, I'll just say teenagers, they are so vocal more than I've seen in the past, right?
Right.
And they are unafraid to say, this is bothering me, or I want this, I don't want this, even though they still are experiencing at many times a higher level of trauma, right? Or emotional discord. And so for them, again, we just have to be skilled. We have to meet them where they are as adults. And I had two teenagers, well, they would say young adults now because one is 19, the other one is getting ready to be 18, and they're both
Okay,
off
okay.
to college. But I'll use myself as an example. I'm always one of those parents who allow my kids to say what it is they need to say. They don't have to, they have to say it respectfully, but they don't have to filter it, right? And
Agree.
there's a
Mhm.
difference because over the years, I've seen a lot of kids who have just been shut down emotionally and they are unable to communicate what they're feeling, what they need, what they've experienced. And so we as adults have to find outlets in meaningful ways to just give kids permission to let them know it's okay to say, this is how I'm feeling. I need help. This is what I need. Because it really is difficult for them many times, even though they are a loud generation. And when I say a loud generation, I mean, through their actions, their behavior, their advocacy, how they respond to situations.
Mhm.
Um,
Right. And you're really speaking to, like you mentioned before, being able to create the safe space
mm,
for adolescents, even younger children. I completely agree with you in the parenting way. My children are much younger, but even so, I have other people that are like, you let them talk to you like that? And I'm like, well, they're not being rude. He's
yeah.
just told me that he didn't appreciate what I said to him.
Mhm.
I can't be upset that he told me that because he didn't appreciate it. We'll work
And
on that later. But I mean,
yeah, and think
being able
about
to
it.
create that safe space is
Mhm.
important, and I do think that the way I was raised, and maybe even generations before me, did not have that open, safe place to be to speak their minds. And
Yeah,
so I agree with you that as clinicians, we've got to be able to mold and change who we perceive and how
yeah,
we perceive things to be able to reach our young clients for sure.
yeah, yeah,
It's a good point.
and think about it as, as children are growing, and let's say as a parent, we always shut them down, or we say, "You can't say that," or we tell boys, "You can't cry,"
Mhm.
or "You can't appear vulnerable." Well, guess what? They're internalizing that.
Yep.
And when they internalize messages like that, it doesn't just stop at the frontal lobe. They are really internalizing it, even sometimes to a cellular level, right? Because then as they get older, and they get in these relationships with their significant other. They can't communicate. They're
Mhm.
breaking up every 24 hours. They can't express how they feel. They don't cry when they need to cry. And
Mhm.
so we just have to be careful about those types of messages.
Absolutely. And speaking of safety, a lot of creating safety is really about building trust and building rapport. And as we both know, that is crucial in therapy. So, how do you approach that with when working with young clients, especially those who have experienced trauma and maybe that trauma came from an adult or maybe even a more trusted adult?
Yeah. So the first thing is I don't force clients, and I don't believe that providers should force clients to move at their pace in order to build rapport or a trusting relationship. It really does have to happen organically in order for that child to get to a level where you can hear them, they can hear you, and that trust is established. And in Embark, we talk a lot about attunement, right? And attunement and moving towards safety does not necessarily happen through talking. It
Mhm.
happens through an experience. And so, even as a provider, you really do have to facilitate an experience of trust with any client that you are working with. And so, whether that is, Very early on, sometimes I would get on the floor and play a game with the kid. We're not talking about the experiences. We're not talking about what mommy and daddy said or did. No, I am meeting that child or that adolescent where they are. I want to know what interests them, what they see kind of happening through the experience. And there is a true attunement that's happening in order to build that trust and do the work. Because the work is scary. Like, who wants to really talk about trauma and talk about what happened? And so, you really have to make sure that that attunement is built. And we do the same work even with our kids and adolescents and their parents. We're helping them to develop that attunement in order to move towards healing.
Nice. I completely agree with you. Again, I feel like I mentioned this off camera, but haven't mentioned it on the show before. But I've been a school social worker, or was a school social worker for about 14 years. And people will come by my office like, girl, what are you doing? Like, are you really in the floor coloring? I am. Uh-huh. They wanted this color sheet, so we are coloring our
Mhm.
Pokemon today. Yes,
Yes.
you can go. Thank you. You can come back later. It's really about a relationship and again, creating that safe place. So while at that moment you may not talk about anything that is of substance, later that child knows or that adolescent knows that your office is where to come to
Yes.
let those things out and they
Yep.
can be whoever they need to be in that place.
Yeah. Yeah, you're setting the foundation.
Mhm.
You are creating safety, that safety net, that trust. And again, that helps them to begin addressing whatever the traumatic issue is, but at the same time, being okay and learning and utilizing those coping skills and addressing some of those cognitions that are holding them in that what I call trauma brain and moving beyond that.
Absolutely. I've heard you mention quite a few times in just, short amount of time that we've been talking about the involvement of family and bringing in the whole family, multiple generations, if they are present. So what I know that there have to be challenges. So tell me some about some of the challenges that may come up with working with families and how do you navigate them?
Yeah. Wow. So sometimes family work can be a huge challenge. And I tell you, in my experience, one of the challenges that I would see oftentimes is because for the families I worked with, there was community based trauma that the child, the mom, the grandparent may have all experienced. And so a lot of times that trauma went unresolved, right? Which
Mhm,
complicated now the kid who's
mhm.
experienced this new trauma and sort of taking on the family trauma.
Yep.
And so oftentimes, even though you can do the family work, you may have to refer that parent or that caregiver to their own individual therapists who address some of their historical trauma or diagnoses to better be a support for that adolescent or that young kid who you're treating. The other piece is a child who may not have an identified, parent who may be in the foster system and
Mm,
who may move from home to home to home. And so, one of the challenges may be, well, who is that steady individual, that person who can act as a support while that child is moving through treatment and show up for that child? So that it's also been a challenge at times. But then, as we talk about the level of trust, there's a lot of parents who will say, well, I don't trust my child, and the child doesn't
mhm,
trust the parent for
mhm.
whatever reason. So, what kind of chaos that could
Oh, yeah.
develop. And so, for programs like we have at Embark, our therapists who are skilled in individual as well as family systems treatments, they really have to be able to get in there and help that family realign the hierarchy, right? Because we have some
Mhm.
kids who come in and the kids are the parents and the parents
Yep.
are the kids, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so it can be tough work, but it is certainly rewarding work when you see that kid who is discharging successfully from treatment or who may come back just as a check in and things are still going pretty well, 6 or 9 months after their initial discharge. So,
Nice, nice. And I'm glad you took me there because that was gonna be my next thing. So we know that this work is incredibly tough. It is not just tough for the families, but it is tough on clinicians to work through these things with children and their families, and sometimes hitting brick walls quite often because the work is difficult. So you mentioned rewarding aspects of working with these youth who have experienced trauma. Can you share a success story with us where you've seen a significant amount of progress and healing in a young client, and what did that look like for them and for you?
Boy, can I. Yes. Over the years, I have been so fortunate to see, to hear, to be a part of many success stories. And I'll share one success story. So at Embark Behavioral Health, we actually offer really one of the only companies that offer a full continuum of treatment for our families. And so that could be long-term treatment, short-term treatment, stepping down to PHP, then IOP, et cetera, right? They're getting support from psychiatrists, nurses throughout the continuum as well. And so one of the that we use is our outcomes. And so regardless of what level of treatment they enter, they are completing outcomes at admissions, during treatment, and post-treatment. Because again, we want to make sure that what we are doing works, and we're doing it every 15 days so that it's
Okay.
like in real time,
Mm.
and a family is not waiting until they discharge to say, oh, this worked or it didn't work. And so we have had a number of families who, again, moving through the whole continuum, and we're looking at their treatment data where we are seeing them systematically get better. And it's not just the kid, it's the parents as well, because we are also receiving outcomes or surveys from the parents, right? And so, one in particular, there was a young lady who she was actually our first client when we first started the clinic division.
Wow.
Yeah. And she had been through treatment for a while. So, this was in 2020. And so when she came in, she experienced some pretty heavy hitting traumatic experiences. During that time, she was taken out of school. She was having a lot of family issues with her siblings, her parents. There was a lot of refusal to go into the community because there was some anxiety as well as some self harm behaviors. And so during her treatment, initially, it was a little up and down, which was expected, right? With anyone going through treatment. However, once she discharged within 6 months, she continued to come back for a follow-up like once a month for about the next 3 to 4 months. And even until today, this young lady still comes back to the clinic. She sees her therapist, and if her therapist is not there, she's making sure that she's speaking with a therapist to just say, "Hey, I used to come here." And she has that, has had the opportunity to speak with other kids to say, "You can do it." So now she's passing it on, which is amazing, because one of the things that I did when I opened that clinic, I actually got, the running batons, the
Yes.
runners use.
Mhm.
I wish I had one here to show you, but I got 150 of those batons made. And it had, well, we have our BHAG. It had our BHAG sign, the little animal, the logo, and some empowering words. And when the kids would discharge, we would have like this discharge ceremony. And the staff, we would pass the baton, and the
I
last
love it.
person to get it was the client.
Love it.
So every time she comes back, she brings her baton. And
Wow.
she talks to the other kids about her, treatment. Her mom has spoken to other moms and fathers in the community about the treatment that she received. And it is just an amazing success story, because honestly, as a client, we can't divulge or disclose who you are, or
Mhm.
but for her to then turn into an advocate
Absolutely.
and come back and encourage and empower other kids and show them, and be pretty transparent about what she experienced is just amazing.
It absolutely is. I don't even know the young lady, but it's giving me a sense, a little bit of inspiring feeling, knowing that she's able to, like you mentioned, pass the baton
Yeah.
on to not just other young people, but even to her community at large. That's awesome.
Yep.
That is awesome. So, what advice would you give then to new therapists who not necessarily maybe even new, but that are new to working with traumatized youth? What should they keep in mind as they begin this type of work? Are there any specific trainings, resources? What would you recommend?
Absolutely. I think that I have been very fortunate to remain a trauma specialist for this long. When I started out in my career, I was working with young boys who were offending animals and other kids. I have done years of work with gang members who had experienced trauma. And then, like I mentioned, specialized in the area of domestic minor sex trafficking. And so I have heard stories for a lifetime. I have supported individuals who I wouldn't dare tell or reshare their stories. And so for younger therapists who want to get or work in the area of trauma, and depending on, what type of work in the area of trauma, my first thing is always self-care. Self-care. If I had not engaged in some serious self-care, I would have burned out a long time ago. As I mentioned, I never really thought of seeing myself as the chief clinical officer of a national company, but here I am because of self-care
Mhm.
and some other things. And so that is number one. That's number one, self-care. And then also, I would tell them, take your time. If you're serious about doing this work and having longevity, take your time because healing doesn't happen overnight. And so the learning for you is not going to happen overnight. You're not going to be an expert overnight. You are going to become great through your experiences and your ability to network, your ability to sometimes just sit back and learn, but also being proactive and develop some strategy around how you want to develop your professional career and you as an individual because it gets tough. It gets tough. And then find a good mentor, find a good coach, find a good supervisor who you can work alongside and learn. But be real, be transparent, and just be willing to do the work. Be willing to do the work. The other thing is, so all of the work that I've done over the years has had a strong social justice lens, right? And that's one area that a lot of therapists, they'll say, oh, I want to do therapy, but they don't
Yeah,
think of
something
the
like that.
social justice side of it.
Mhm.
And that in and of itself is work,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
so I always say be brave and do the work. Talk to other DEI specialists, understand what social justice means as it relates to mental health, because there are a lot of injustices that are happening even in the mental health space.
Mhm.
And you want to always remember equity as well, because a big part of this work is being an advocate, not just for yourself, but those who you are treating and those in your community and other communities. So I think that would be my top advice for new therapists.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Before I let you go, I did not want to skip over a bill that you authored. So you authored Georgia's first domestic minor sex trafficking protocol for
Yes.
schools. As a former school employee, I find that to be fascinating because it is something that schools are really starting to look into and
Yes.
really focus on. So can you share what that experience was like and what really motivated you to get involved in creating this groundbreaking policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I did that really in honor of many of the young girls and boys who I was just honored to advocate for and to treat who were involved in domestic minor sex trafficking. And as you mentioned, sex trafficking has been around for such a long time. There's still some individuals who don't believe it's happening even in their own backyard. It is happening everywhere. And it is number two to drug sales. And the only reason why it's not number one is because drugs are drugs, right? But unfortunately, with the kid or individual, you can sell them over and over and over and over again, even in one night. I believe that it is one of the most heinous crimes against our children, against anyone who is forced to be sold. And so for me, I also had a personal reason because I had a niece who was also sold. And so over the past 15, 16 years, just doing this work, and it really hit me one day where I had a young girl who I was working with in the juvenile system. And oftentimes the girls who we worked with would come in front of the bench with like a petty crime. But when we sat and we talked with them and the parents and did our assessment, we found out that it was because they were being trafficked. And so every morning her mom would send her out the house to get on a school bus, but her mom wouldn't walk with her. While her mom thought she was getting on that school bus, her pimp was waiting at that school bus stop, and she would have to get in the car. And he knew the schedule because every time the school bus would come back to drop the kids off, he was dropping her off. And so she wasn't making it to school. Yeah. And so it was because of what happened with this one particular young lady that I started working alongside a school district appointee. Now she is the school district board chair. Her name is Erica Mitchell. And together we wrote that policy because, again, schools are sometimes just a breeding ground, right?
Mhm.
Because you also have peer recruiters who are other kids who their pimp or buyer may send them to bring other kids in. And we just know the risk that is where kids are spending the majority of their time during the day. And we understand the impact that it can have when kids are missing school and experiencing a trauma as such. And so we wanted all schools to be equipped with the ability to recognize when something was happening to a child. Because we would tell the schools, it's not your responsibility to assess. No, if you see something, say something, we'll handle the rest, or law enforcement will handle the rest. But for school personnel, they are, just prime professionals to recognize when something is going on with a child.
Right.
So that is how that policy was born. And again, just having the honor to work with hundreds of families. It has truly been a journey and one that I am so honored, that the families allowed me and other professionals to just partner with them and address.
Nice. Nice work. So, what advice do you have for therapists or even social activists or social workers or whoever looking to make an impact in their own state's policies? Because I personally did not know that such policies existed. I mean, we would, create
Yep.
countywide or district wide initiatives, but it wasn't, to the level that there was an actual protocol that was observed, countywide or district wide or
Yep.
statewide.
So, number one, see if there's a policy, right? If there's not a policy, then I always believe you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Take the policy that we wrote, right? And if it works for your county, your school district, use it. You may have to tweak it here or there, but also reach out, form those connections, those networks, because doing this type of work, you have to do it within a system of care or collaboratively because trauma impacts so many areas of our lives and functioning. And so collaborate, but make that policy your own. And if it's not one, then I say advocate for one to be developed and ensure that those safeguards are put in place for the kids that your county is serving.
Nice. Thank you for that. And I mean, I know I could keep chatting with you forever, but where can our listeners learn more about your work with Embark Behavioral Health, any resources that you have available?
Yeah, absolutely. Very easy. www.embark.com. And so that's Embark, Embark, B is in boy, H is in Harry.com. My information is there. Our admissions department, number and process is there. Anything that you want to learn about Embark is there. And we also have a lot of resources on that page. And so, resources related to different diagnoses or support systems, which we also offer free parenting group. All of those resources are listed there and the telephone number. And so, I tell people they can call me directly. They can call our admissions department directly. We have someone answering the phone at all times, but reach out. Don't be afraid to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Charlotte, I really have appreciated you speaking with me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. The resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.